Hello, I'm Grace Karskens and I'm the author of People of the River, Lost Worlds of Early Australia. This book is about two lost worlds of early Australia. The first one is the story of the settlement of Australia by convicts from 1788 and the way those convicts became the settlers on the Hawkesbury-Nepean River, a beautiful and mysterious river that encircles the Cumberland Plain and the Sydney region. But the second story is another lost story which is much longer and much deeper. It is the story of the Aboriginal people of Dyarubbin, which is the Aboriginal name for the Hawkesbury-Nepean, and it goes back 50,000 years. Lots of things. It's a very long book. This book actually explores the worlds of these two groups of people, and it charts the way their cultures collided and the long war that erupted over the dispossession of the Aboriginal people who fought hard for their country. But it's also about how Aboriginal people managed to survive and still live on the river today. How did they do that after all the things that befell them? But I also want to tell the story of what life was like on the river. And so I do that through exploring farming and how they survived floods, and also I have long chapters on what meant most to people, both sides. So the story of family, the story of culture, and the story of sacred country. And the takeaways, I would hope that people would have a better idea of what the real purpose of the founding of modern Australia was about. It wasn't a jail, it was a colony, and the settlers were to be the convicts. This is a lost story. I'm hoping people will find it really interesting. But the other big story, of course, is the lost world of Aboriginal people, and the fact that our history doesn't start in 1788. It starts at least 50,000 years ago on this river, and of course, more than 65,000 years ago across the Australian continent. It's a challenge, but it's very important to me. And I'm kind of interested in how the myths grew up too. So why did we end up having the story that the convicts didn't do anything and failed as farmers and were all drunken louts? Well, it's very interesting to find out that that was invented by free settlers who came along 40 years later. So that's because I'm interested. I love to tell, and I find the true stories much more interesting than, say, the stories that you might have learnt at school, you know, that the Aboriginal people disappeared. No, they didn't. That the convicts failed. No, they didn't. So the story is then, what happened? How did this story unfold? That's the story I like to tell. Oh, I certainly did. I loved libraries as a child, and they were my lifeline, and books were too. So there was a wonderful small School of Arts library opposite my school in Borkham Hills in the pioneering era, and it was really dusty and dark, and it had sort of slants of sunlight, and you could see the dust playing in sunlight, and it smelled of old books. Old books have a special smell, and I loved it. And then we got a new library at Borkham Hills, which was all modern and fluorescent and had all the books in order and everything. And I used to go there every Friday, get 3 books, which was the limit, read them over the weekend, back on Monday, every single week. I was a complete bookworm, and I love libraries. Actually, when I was about 12, I read Eleanor Dark's The Timeless Land, which was a copy that we had in our family because my mum had given it to my father for his birthday. And they were migrants, and they were trying to learn something about this country. And that was the first serious history book, and I called it a history book because she did a lot of research for that book, genuine research, not just light research. And I know I'm looking back now from the perspective of what I've done since then, but I do think it inspired me because it really spoke to me about the landscape that I was living in at the time in Western Sydney, and there was no other information about it. And I had a pretty vivid imagination, and it was just wonderful to read this book about Aboriginal people and settlers in that particular landscape. And I like to think it had a lasting impact on the way I work, actually. When I'm not writing, that means I'm procrastinating. That's why I'm not writing. But there are many things. One of my favourite things is to get out on country, especially with the Dyarubbin women I'm working with and other Aboriginal people, because you see so much more. But you know, I love reading. I still love reading, and sharing food and wine with friends and family, and seeing the grandchildren. You know, and COVID has taught me to be a gardener, so I've renovated the garden over the COVID emergency, which has been good.